If you ask the average Joe on the street how Frankenstein was written, you'll probably hear that on a dark, stormy night, the poet Lord Byron proposed a ghost story competition at his summer estate. 18-year-old Mary Shelley went to bed that night, but awoke with a terrible nightmare about an undead creature that came back to life. So inspired, she wrote the entirety of Frankenstein in one night. This is the story Mr. Joe, as well as myself, have been told. Though impressive and with hints of truth, it flattens the complex reality of a text we herald for being complex. We often see Frankenstein as the miraculous work of an 18-year-old, someone so young, written in just the length of a summer's vacation, when in actuality, Frankenstein endured 15 years worth of edits. Now, all of my writers who look back on their drafts from, say, a week ago, and want to set it on fire, know how drastic of not just a skill difference, but a belief difference 15 years is going to be. A lot changed for Mary Shelley and the world in those 15 years. And you easily could have read any combination of that change in thought and skill without knowing which version you were reading, or that there was a different version at all. Upon discovering this, I decided I would do a tandem read of both versions at the same time. I read both the 1818 text, finished when Mary Shelley was 20, and the 1831 text, written when Mary Shelley was 34, flipping between them every chapter. I went crazy, you're about to go slightly crazy too, so today let's look at the history and insane differences between Mary Shelley's two Frankensteins. Before we get into the fun stuff, let's start with a brief history of the different editions' publications. So, like I said, there are some hints of truth in the myth. In 1816, famous poet Lord Byron invited some guests over to his summer house, the Villa Diodati, near Lake Geneva in Switzerland. These guests include his personal physician and possible lover, John Polidori, who also wrote The Vampire, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley's husband, and famous poet of works like Ozymandias, the adventurous Claire Clairmont, Mary Shelley's stepsister, and of course, Mary Shelley. Due to an actual volcanic eruption in Indonesia, the summer was strangely cold and rainy, so the group had to stay inside. Lord Byron proposed a ghost story writing competition to keep them busy. Mary Shelley comes up with Frankenstein after what she herself calls in the preface to the 1831 edition, quote, "the spectre which had haunted my midnight pillow." So yes, a nightmare. But here we have the first deviation in our myth about Frankenstein's road to publication. Between about July 17th, 1816 to August of that same year, Mary finishes a novella-length narrative. Not the full text this myth would have us believe she cranked out in one night. Now, the 1818 text is published anonymously, with most reviewers believing it was written by either Lord Byron because of the 1818 preface's mention of a story, quote, suggested in casual conversation in, quote, the summer of 1816 in the environs of Geneva, end quote. And everyone knew that's where my guy was hanging out. Or Percy Shelley, due to the fact his poem Mutability is included in the text. And the book itself is dedicated to William Godwin. William Godwin, a radical thinker who believed in philosophical anarchy and things like free love, was also Mary Shelley's father, Percy's father-in-law. But women don't write, so people thought Percy Shelley, her husband, and more notably, Godwin's devoted student, was the true writer of Frankenstein. And you know what? They were right for like a page and a half of the text because Percy did write the preface to the 1818 edition. But the extent of Percy's involvement in the 1818 text is one that still weighs on scholars' minds. There are quite a few drafts that have varying levels of edits from both Mary and Percy. He tends to change words like have to possess, or phrases like it was safe to the danger of infection was past. The funny thing is, though, is that Mary and Percy's handwriting is really similar, so it's a bit harder to tell them apart and get an exact estimate of his involvement, but most scholars agree it's definitely not enough to merit him as a co-author. Sadly, in 1822, though, Percy drowns in a boating accident. There really are no words to describe Mary Shelley's grief. It is in fact true that she kept his calcified heart with her after he died. But Percy isn't the only person who had some influence on what future publications would look like. In 1823, Frankenstein becomes so popular that a stage play is put on called Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein. In anticipation of the popularity of the play, Mary Shelley's father, William Godwin, makes arrangements for a new edition. The first one to have Mary Shelley's name, her full name, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, after her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, on the title page. Now, you'll notice I didn't include the 1823 edition in my comparison, which is mainly because all of the 123 edits Godwin made are included in the 1831 edition. This leads most scholars to think that Mary didn't use the original 1818 version as the copy text for the 1831 Frankenstein. She probably used the most recently edited version, the one edited by her father, the 1823 version. But when it was revealed that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, people, of course, didn't believe her. They said Percy wrote it, and as Knight's Quarterly magazine said in 1824, quote, "It was wrongfully attributed to his wife," end quote. So of course, Mary Shelley makes a point in the 1831 preface to clear all this up real quick. Before the creation of Frankenstein, Mary clarifies she had always been a writer. But after she got married, she says, quote, "My life became busier," end quote. But Percy, quote, "desired I should write, not so much with the idea that I could produce anything worthy of notice, but that he might himself judge how fair I possessed the promised better things hereafter," end quote. She follows this up with, quote, "Still, I did nothing," end quote. However, she is fair about mentioning his involvement, writing, quote, "I certainly did not owe the suggestion of one incident, nor scarcely of one train of feeling to my husband, and yet, but for his incitement, it would never have taken form in which it was presented to the world," end quote. But this preface isn't just her scrambling to prove herself. She talks about how Frankenstein came to be, the Villa Diodati, Shakespeare, nature, and a nightmare. And then she makes a note on the changes she made. She writes the changes are, quote, "principally those of style. I have changed no portion of the story, nor introduced any new ideas or circumstances," end quote. She claims that she has left, quote, "the core and substance of it untouched," end quote. And I guess nobody fact-checked her. Until now, the 1831 edition was more often than not the Frankenstein you would see in the bookstore, or the one you'd be taught in class. This stems from the fact that in Mary Shelley's time, it was most common for novels to be published in 3 volumes. The 1831 Frankenstein, however, was reprinted in 1 volume, meaning it was relatively cheaper and more accessible. As time went on and we get into the 20th century, the 1831 version remained not only the cheapest version, but since it was the most recently edited by Mary Shelley, it remained the authoritative version. Because hey, the core of it is untouched, right? But recently, a good amount of scholars have started to disagree that the 1831 Frankenstein should be the authoritative version. They argue that by 1831, Mary had a great deal of distance from the events that inspired the story. The fact her mother, foundational proto-feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, died of complications after giving birth to Mary, the death of Mary Shelley's own child, and the dream she had that her baby came back to life after warming it by the fire, and the more radical ideas Mary Shelley subscribed to as a teenager. They argue that by 1831, she was more influenced by the personal and worldly events that had happened since then. But just to quickly put in my own 2 cents, I also believe some of the changes are Mary Shelley just maturing as a writer. There are a lot of changes in the book I genuinely believe make the text better from a technical standpoint. She rephrases lines for clarity. For example, in the 1818 version, we have, quote, "How great was the difficulty to persuade my father that it was not absolutely necessary for a merchant not to understand anything except bookkeeping," end quote. But in 1831, she cuts the double negative for an easier reading experience. Quote, "How great was the difficulty to persuade my father that all necessary knowledge was not comprised in the noble art of bookkeeping," end quote. She also adds punctuation for an easier reading experience. Instead of saying, quote, "Among the lessons that Felix had bestowed upon Safie geography had not been omitted," end quote, Shelley adds a comma, so it's, quote, "Among the lessons that Felix had bestowed upon Safie, geography had not been omitted," end quote. So we're not saying there is something called Safie geography. Now, you may say this isn't improper grammar. It's showing the intended rhythm the text is to be read in. It's a revolutionary stylistic choice. And hey, if that's the reading experience you prefer, that's what you prefer. When it comes to comparing these 2 editions, I don't really prefer one over the other. They are just so different. The 1818 Frankenstein is more radical. There is a lot more subtlety, and it's a slow unveiling of the horrors within these characters. 1831, though, is more dramatic, more like a ghost story that hooks you with its more foreboding chapter ends. To me, it's also more writerly sound, with a lot of redundant lines being cut or changed. But in terms of actual content, I do find it a bit reductive to Mary Shelley's talents to cling too deeply to the 1818 version due to psychic distance from the events that we assume inspired it. It diminishes her creative talent and imagination to say she was just transcribing what happened to her. Because, oh yeah, you're talking about the woman who literally invented the science fiction genre. So much so that when reviewers were writing about Frankenstein, they didn't even have the proper terms to describe it. Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine writes in 1818, quote, "This is a novel, or more properly a romantic fiction of a nature so peculiar that we ought to describe the species before attempting any account of individual production." End quote. Then again, I might be a little biased in this regard because I would be so mad if someone said the story I wrote as a teenager was better than the one I wrote as a grown adult. This video isn't an argument for reading one version over the other, but an examination of what can be found in the negative space between the two texts. Because you know what? If you're asking me which version I prefer, I'm gonna say both. And that's not just some cop-out, "oh, there are good things about both of them" answer. I mean both at the same time. Not picking one and ignoring the other, but looking at them as a pair necessary to understanding the whole. Though the 1818 and 1831 editions are very different and often pitted against one another, I think if we look at them together, we find the masterpiece that has kept people talking about this book for 2 centuries. Let me explain. To start, Walton, the naval captain whose letters frame the whole text, his letters remain pretty much the same in both versions, but once we get into Victor's story, things start diverging a lot. In Volume 1, the 1818 version and the 1831 version are off by 1 chapter, because 1831 expands the original chapter 1 and splits it into 2. The first of which is Victor's parents' backstory. In the original 1818 Frankenstein, Victor's father, Alphonse Frankenstein, is a Genevan magistrate. His longtime friend, Beaufort, loses all his money and falls ill. His daughter, Caroline, doesn't despair over them having to move into a smaller house, but works to provide for her family and care for her father. Unfortunately, though, he eventually dies. But Alphonse, quote, "came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife." End quote. Now, Madison, did you just say that Caroline's father was longtime friends with Alphonse? Wouldn't that mean he's like a lot older than her? Yes, but this is not acknowledged in the 1818 edition. The story just goes on after this line. But the 1831 version adds, quote, "there was a considerable difference between the ages of my parents, but their circumstance seemed to unite them only closer in bonds of devoted affection." End quote. Now, some people note that Mary and Percy themselves had an age gap relationship, to put it kindly, with them starting to date when Mary was 16 and Percy was 21, married with a child and another on the way. Sorry, just had to get it in there. But scholars argue that Mary made the 1831 version more conservative due to its rise in popularity and attention. Remember that play I mentioned? People protested it because they thought Frankenstein was encouraging immorality. They couldn't even just name the play Frankenstein. They had to name it Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, headlining Victor's sin to show that the story is a cautionary tale, not a playbook. 1831 Frankenstein has a new self-awareness that dictates some of the changes made. Things start having to be justified, like the age gap. While in the 1818 version, Alphonse retires when Caroline starts having children, in the 1831 version, Alphonse retires to take care of Caroline. It's emphasized she is still reeling from the death of her father, so it makes it feel like the text is trying to say, hey, this age gap relationship is fine. I mean, like, look at how great of a husband he is. He is retiring to take care of her full time. But it ends up having a sort of sinister undertone. Take a look at this line. Quote, "Everything was made to yield to her wishes and convenience. He strove to shelter her, as a fair exotic is sheltered by the gardener, from every rougher wind, and to surround her with all that could tend to excite pleasurable emotion in her soft and benevolent mind." End quote. This is not found at all in 1818. Now, what I love about Frankenstein is, yes, you can read this as a more conservative, somewhat self-conscious retelling, but just like how I don't think we should limit our view of this story by only looking at one of the 2 editions, I don't think we should limit ourselves with only one form of analysis. This is really crucial when looking at the changes made between these 2 versions, so I think it's time we learn what I think is the most important form of analysis for a text, for any text. I mean, seriously, you won't be able to look at any story the same after this. That is Watsonian versus Doylist analysis. Named after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his fictional character Dr. Watson in his Sherlock Holmes series, these 2 analyses approach texts in the way their names suggest. Doylist analysis, named after the real-life author, looks at a text from our real-life world. Watsonian analysis, named after the fictional character, looks at a text from in the context of that fictional world. Siebold. Outside of Frankenstein, a great example of this would be Katniss's relationship with femininity in The Hunger Games. If we're looking at it from a Doylist perspective, Katniss's disdain for makeup, pretty clothes, and anything feminine fits into that internalized misogyny we often see in these strong female leads in the 2010s. However, if we look at those same dislikes from a Watsonian perspective, as in Katniss's world perspective, it also makes sense Katniss would hate the expensive aesthetics she associates with the capital. If we're looking at Frankenstein, a Doylist analysis of the change to Victor's parents would be that Mary Shelley tamed the story down to suit a wider audience. A Watsonian analysis would remember that this entire story is told to us first by Victor, who is incredibly biased no matter if you're talking about the 1818 Victor or the 1831 Victor, because yes, they are incredibly different. But it makes sense that either Victor, Walton, or even Margaret, the person Walton is sending these letters to, and in turn telling us, are editorializing for our ears. They're trying to make Victor sound like a great guy with a great family. Now, both these interpretations are right, but they come at this from two very different perspectives. What Mary Shelley may have intended, and what these characters may have intended. If we're looking at this in a Doylist way, the 1831 text's new justification of itself can only extend so much, though. Instead of keeping Elizabeth's origin story and trying to justify it like she did with Victor's parents, Shelley completely changes it. Caroline gets a bit more of an active role in this, for the worst, in my opinion. In the original 1818, Elizabeth, Victor's love interest, is his first cousin. Straight up. Alphonse's sister dies and her daughter Elizabeth is sent to live with the Frankensteins. And Caroline loves Elizabeth's, quote, gentle and affectionate disposition, end quote, so much so that Victor says, quote, these indications determined my mother to consider Elizabeth as my future wife, end quote. Straight up. In 1831, though, there is no incest. Instead, Caroline and young Victor are kind enough to go visit the poor people. Quote, their benevolent disposition often made them enter the cottages of the poor. This, to my mother, was more than a duty. It was a necessity, a passion, remembering what she had suffered and how she had been relieved, for her to act in turn the guardian angel to the afflicted. End quote. Remember that guardian angel phrasing. So Caroline enters the cottage and there are 5 children there. But, quote, among these, there was one which attracted my mother far above all the rest, end quote. Can you guess why? Quote, the 4 others were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants, but, quote, this child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, her blue eyes cloudless, and her lips and the molding of her face so expressive of sensibility and sweetness that none could behold her without looking on her as of a distinct species, a being heaven-sent. End quote. I've seen an interpretation of this change saying Caroline gets more agency and layering to her character by being kind enough to choose to take Elizabeth in, rather than it being a familial obligation. I say that guardian angel Caroline is choosing to bring this child into a supremely wealthy home because of how pretty and white she is. So this is the start of a lot of weird race stuff that is brought into the 1831 text. While there are minor, entirely unnecessary additions, like Walton saying Victor sits, quote, as silent as a Turk, end quote, the most unlikely character becomes the vehicle for this addition. Victor's childhood best friend, Henry Clerval. Victor also introduces Henry in these first 2 chapters. In the 1818 version, quote, Henry Clerval was the son of a merchant in Geneva, an intimate friend of my father. He was a boy of singular talent and fancy. He wrote fairy tales and, quote, his favorite study consisted in books of chivalry and romance, end quote. Now, let's take a look at that same passage in the 1831 version. Quote, Henry Clerval was the son of a merchant in Geneva. He was a boy of singular talent and fancy. He loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake, end quote. Yeah, so the 1831 version also cranks up the level of colonialism present in Frankenstein. In the original, it's more of a subtext, mostly seen in how the creature is treated. One of the most explicit examples I can think of is when the creature overhears Safi learning about the Native American genocide and cries for them. Now, this moment is in both texts, but there is a distinct difference in how Shelley is preluding this information. You can even see this in the added aggression in Shelley's variation of word choice. In 1818, Victor says, quote, we used to act plays composed out of these, Henry's, favorite books, end quote. In 1831, Victor says Henry, quote, tried to make us act plays of enchantment and knightly adventures. The chivalrous train who shed their blood to redeem the holy scepter from the hands of the infidels. Infidels, if you didn't know, are people who do not believe in the predominant religion at the time. Sound familiar? This kind of conquering mentality pollutes the defining aspects of the original Henry. While in the 1818 version, Henry learns Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit simply because he wants to, in the 1831 version, he only learns Middle Eastern languages. Why? Because when Henry grows up, quote, his design was to visit India, in the belief that he had in his knowledge of its various languages, and in the views he had taken of its society, the means of materially assisting the progress of European colonization and trade, end quote. Okay, so what is happening here? When I first read it, I was aware of the general history of enslavement in Europe. Though the Abolition of Slave Trade Act was passed in 1807, it didn't really say much about freeing people who were already enslaved. And slavery still wasn't illegal. That doesn't happen until the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, 2 years after the last edition of Frankenstein releases. I thought Shelley was responding to this by intentionally making the 1831 characters much more sinister. I mean, when Victor is describing himself as a child, in 1831 he literally says, quote, my temper was sometimes violent, end quote. That, in addition with how much more explicit the 1831 version is, made me think Shelley was trying to emphasize how bad these people are, so we really couldn't miss the message. That's why all of this race and colonization stuff is emphasized. She's not endorsing it, she's making it impossible for us to not get that Victor is an unreliable narrator who holds detestable beliefs. I'm not so confident in that theory now. So as I did more research, I found that in an 1824 debate about whether enslaved people should be freed, British Foreign Secretary George Canning said, quote, to turn enslaved people loose in the manhood of his physical strength, in the maturity of his physical passion, but in the infancy of his uninstructed reason, would be to raise up a creature resembling the splendid fiction of a recent romance, end quote. Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's immediate reaction to this? Quote, Canning paid a compliment to Frankenstein in a manner sufficiently pleasing to me, end quote. And even 3 years later, in 1827, she holds the same opinion, bragging in a letter to Teresa Guiccioli, Byron's lover, quote, did you know that he, Canning, praised my Frankenstein in honorable terms in the House of Commons? Extremely pleasing to me. End quote. While a Watsonian analysis might support that these characters are just all around more sinister, that it's more likely that such rich people like the Frankensteins would associate with the Clervals, a rich business family that makes its money off of colonizing, we can't ignore the Doylist analysis here, where Mary Shelley's conservative changes to the text might be in earnest. If she is trying to appease a more conservative audience, a pioneering colonizer, businessman, might be someone audiences are more attracted to and more likely to mourn when he is so young in his career, unable to fulfill his colonizing enterprise quest. The cherry on top of this, Henry, the colonizer, is murdered by the creature, a character Canning aligns with enslaved people. I've seen interpretations of this say this is empowering, and others say that Shelley is feeding into these people's fears. That's not for me to decide, but I thought it was important to note as this is one of the most major edits in the text. One of the biggest grievances about the changes in the 1831 version is this severe change in politics. We've now seen Shelley make characters perpetrators of these conservative ideas, but what about victims of it? In both editions, Elizabeth catches scarlet fever. In 1818, quote, her illness was not severe and she quickly recovered, end quote. But in 1831, her illness was severe and she was in the greatest danger. Like I said, the 1831 version is very dramatic. But the key difference is Caroline's role in Elizabeth's recovery. In 1818, since Elizabeth's illness was not severe and she recovered quickly, Caroline went into her sick room before Elizabeth stopped being contagious, which causes Caroline to get sick too. In 1831, since Elizabeth is in the greatest danger, Caroline ignores everyone's warnings and goes in to tend to Elizabeth, causing Caroline to get sick. In the original, Caroline just dies, in a way that's more realistic, I guess, in that she just got sick without any real reason, like you would in real life. While in the edited version, she dies more as a sacrifice, with a more narrative purpose. This is where we have to pay attention to Mary Shelley's word choice again. In 1818, on Caroline's deathbed, she says to Elizabeth, quote, Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to your younger cousins, end quote. But in 1831, she says, quote, Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children, end quote. In the 1831 edition, Elizabeth is not blood related to the Frankensteins and distinctly not part of the family. Caroline points that out here. But if we're looking at both editions, it doesn't matter whether she's blood related or not. Her gender traps her into being a caregiver for the family, someone who must put aside her desires and submit to others' wishes. 1818 Elizabeth and 1831 Elizabeth have very different responses to this. Victor takes the time to give Henry pretty defined interests in the beginning chapter or chapters. Either Henry likes fairy tales and plays, or colonization and colonization. As for Elizabeth, in 1818, Victor says Elizabeth, quote, busied herself in following the aerial creations of the poets. The world was to me a secret, which I desired to discover. To her it was a vacancy, which she sought to people with imaginations of her own. End quote. Now, I really like this introduction because we establish what Elizabeth's interested in, and we see Victor acknowledge that their interests are different, but both of equal value. This characterizes Victor as a more commendable person in comparison to 1831 Victor, but in 1831, Elizabeth's interest in poets is largely cut. When Victor compares himself to her, he says, quote, Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition, but, with all my ardor, I was capable of a more intense application. End quote. In this word choice, he positions himself higher than her in their differences. After that, Victor takes the time to describe his love for science, Henry's passion for enterprise, and how, quote, the saintly soul of Elizabeth shone like a shrine-dedicated lamp in our peaceful home. Her sympathy was ours, her smile, her soft voice, the sweet glance of her celestial eyes were ever there to bless and animate us. End quote. The 1831 version changes Elizabeth from a fan of poets into a lamp. Oh, sorry, not just a lamp. Victor's lamp. But I don't think this is necessarily a bad edit. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there is a negative space between these two novels. In 1831, Victor does give a very vague aside about Elizabeth's interests. Quote, while my companion contemplated with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearances of things, I delighted in investigating their causes. End quote. Basically saying Elizabeth is simple enough to be satisfied looking at how pretty things are, but this line reads as a modification of the 1818 line we just read, where Victor acknowledges and respects him and Elizabeth's differences. The line where he acknowledges her interests in poets. While some people argue that Shelley's edits flatten Elizabeth's character, since Victor is an incredibly biased narrator, a Watsonian analysis when looking between these two novels is that in both editions, young Elizabeth actually is the same character. In both of them, she likes poets and contemplating the world and applying herself to her studies. But only 1818 Victor cares to acknowledge this. 1831 Victor, a character who emphasizes his ownership over Elizabeth, his objectification of her, either wouldn't care to repeat this to Walton, or he simply didn't register her interest as a child because he didn't see her as a full person. Again, people like to rag on the 1831 edition for its change in politics, emphasizing the colonialism in one, but reducing the feminism in the other. I don't know if I'd say it's reducing it or providing a different, more tragic angle. In both editions, no matter if Elizabeth's intellect is respected or not, she is still relegated to raising Victor, his two younger brothers, William and Ernest, and Victor's father for some reason. This, doubled with Caroline's dying wish for her to submit to the needs of others, sets up a very interesting arc for Elizabeth, the varying results of which have different takeaways. One of the major changes in regards to this idea of submission comes in Volume 1, Chapter 5 or 6, depending on which edition you're reading. Victor's younger brother Ernest was a sick child, but now that he's grown up, Alphonse and Elizabeth discuss what his future profession might be. In the original, Elizabeth suggests that Ernest should be a farmer, because he has enjoyed being outside since becoming well enough to do so, and that farmers have the, quote, most beneficial profession of any, end quote. But Alphonse thinks Ernest should become a lawyer in the hopes he will then become a judge. Elizabeth disagrees, telling Alphonse that being a farmer is not just more honorable, but Ernest would be more happy, because it's a judge's, quote, misfortune to, quote, meddle with the dark side of human nature, end quote. Alphonse's response, quote, my uncle smiled and said that I ought to be an advocate, a lawyer, myself, which put an end to the conversation on that subject, end quote. What a line. Hey, you're so good at arguing. You should be a lawyer. Oh wait, you're a woman. Sorry. 1831 Elizabeth isn't posed with exactly the same problem. Following in line with the extra colonialism in the 1831 version, Ernest wants to join the military. Both Alphonse and Elizabeth don't like this idea, but Elizabeth says, quote, I fear that he will become an idler, unless we yield the point, and permit him to enter on the profession which he has selected, end quote. She and Alphonse don't put up much of a fight. And instead of even being teased with the idea of her spending her time becoming a lawyer, she says, quote, "My trifling occupations take up my time and amuse me, and I am rewarded for any exertions by seeing none but happy, kind faces around me." End quote. Both Elizabeths are severely domesticated, but 1831 Elizabeth bears it without fight. She embraces it, it seems. A lot of people argue for the 1818 Elizabeth because despite her being put in similar situations, she argues against it. Feminism! But I wouldn't disregard 1831 Elizabeth entirely. Later in the book, the creature murders William and frames Justine, a servant in the Frankenstein household. This is a huge blow to Elizabeth, who says she loves Justine like a, quote, more than sister. Justine pleads guilty even though she didn't do it. When Victor and Elizabeth visit Justine in her cell, knowing she will most likely be executed, Elizabeth says in both editions, quote, "Do not mourn, my dear girl. I will ever proclaim your innocence." End quote. In the 1818 version, though, Elizabeth follows this line up with, quote, "Yet you must die. I never can survive so horrible a misfortune." End quote. To which Justine implores Elizabeth not to cry, and to, quote, "raise me with thoughts of a better life, and elevate me from the petty cares of this world of injustice and strife." End quote. This is where we get a major point of argument from those who prefer the 1818 version. Elizabeth is well aware of this injustice. In fact, she has a whole speech criticizing the death penalty. Just to give you a taste of how unashamed she is to share her opinion, she says, quote, "When one creature is murdered, another is immediately deprived of life in a slow, torturing manner. Then the executioners, their hands yet reeking with the blood of innocence, believe that they have done a great deed." End quote. That's entirely cut in 1831, but it's replaced with something else. Elizabeth is more adamant about freeing Justine, saying instead, quote, "Do not mourn, my dear girl. I will ever proclaim your innocence. I will melt the stony hearts of your enemies by my tears and prayers. You shall not die." End quote. But Justine does not acknowledge the injustice of the situation. No, she says, quote, "I do now not fear to die. That pang is past. God raises my weakness and gives me courage to endure the worst. Learn from me, dear lady, to submit in patience to the will of heaven." End quote. And there it is again, Elizabeth being told to submit. In 1831, the one time Elizabeth refuses to submit to the way things are, to a person she thought would wholeheartedly embrace this breaking of gender norms to save her life, reinforces what she has been told her entire life. Submit. And she does. In 1818, after Justine is executed, Elizabeth says, quote, "The innocent suffers, but she who I'm thought amiable and good has not betrayed the trust I reposed in her, and I am consoled." End quote. Weird to center yourself, but okay. But in 1831, Elizabeth does not speak at all. Victor just says, quote, "I turn to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of my Elizabeth." End quote. And then he continues to think about himself and how it's his fault. When Victor goes to leave for 2 years to make the creature's bride, in 1818, Elizabeth accepts this, but calls out the double standard. Victor says she, quote, "only regretted that she had not the same opportunities of enlarging her experience and cultivating her understanding." End quote. But in 1831, Elizabeth just cries, giving Victor a, quote, "tearful, silent farewell." From then on, Elizabeth gets no more changes in the text. Who's to say that she's not also mourning in the 1831 edition the same thing that she is in the 1818 edition, that she doesn't get to go like Victor does? She finally, wholeheartedly, submits. Whether you subscribe to the Doylist analysis that Shelley is endorsing the idea of submission, appeasing that conservatism, or the Watsonian analysis that this Elizabeth, with what she's been taught about a woman's place and the people around her heavily enforcing her to submit, is reacting naturally, that's still up to you. But I highly encourage you not to look at it as one or the other, but both. How if Shelley was in fact trying to domesticate Elizabeth more, she didn't succeed in flattening her, but ended up highlighting another woman's issue. While 1818 Elizabeth is highlighting how women have to fight against the status quo, 1831 Elizabeth is showing how when women try, even when it matters most, they are immediately shot down and encouraged to keep submitting. And for self-preservation, they accept this. This is what I mean by the added depth of looking at these two books together. Like how the 1818 Victor compares him and Elizabeth, they are different, but both of equal value. I've teased a little bit about how different Victor is, but the interesting thing about the text is that a lot of these massive changes are not just contained to the first volume, but the first few chapters. As the book progresses, the changes dwindle, and by the latter half of the book, For the most part, the only changes being made are to punctuation and word choice. But how Victor is set up in these first few chapters completely colors how we look at his actions, and honestly everything, that is nearly identical by the end. When Victor is describing Henry and Elizabeth in the opening chapters, he also describes himself. In 1831, we get that added line of him being violent that I mentioned. We also get characterization of him and how he describes Elizabeth as either a different but full person with her own interests, or a lamp. But in 1818, Victor ends chapter 2 by saying, quote, "Neither of us, Elizabeth, Henry, and even his parents, possessed the slightest prominence over the other. The voice of command was never heard amongst us, but mutual affection engaged us all to comply with and obey the slightest desire of each other." End quote. This contributes to that lighter tone of 1818. Victor doesn't seem like that bad of a guy. He has loving parents who encourage him to study what he wants. He has kind friends. But like I said, 1818 is subtle. There's that added layer of foreboding because, remember, this is a frame tale. We know Victor is going to end up alone and injured in Antarctica. But why would so good of a guy end up alone? 1831 garners that same foreboding feeling, but with the opposite tactic. Victor ends chapter 1 talking about Elizabeth. She is, quote, "my more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only." End quote. Victor and the book itself are much more sinister from the start. We are tearing through this book because if this is how bad he is in childhood, what could an adult Victor have done to end up alone and severely injured in Antarctica? But let me be clear, I'm not arguing that 1818 Victor is a stand-up guy. No. He has the same sinister capability too. But 1818 is much more slow to reveal this. When Victor goes to university, he meets one of his professors, Mr. Crimp. In 1818, he first describes him like this, quote, "He received me with politeness, and asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science appertaining to natural philosophy." End quote. Victor replies that he has been studying the works of Cornelius Agrippa, excuse me if I'm saying that wrong, who wrote a lot about the occult and was basically looked at as more of a magician than a scientist. Mr. Crump says Victor has wasted his time reading such nonsense. Victor goes home and suddenly his description of Mr. Crump changes. Mr. Crump is no longer a polite guy. He's not even in front of him anymore, and Victor takes the time to storm around his apartment thinking, quote, "Mr. Crump was a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance." End quote. But in 1831, Victor comes out with this mentality right off the bat. Mr. Crump isn't described as polite. No, that line is switched with, quote, "He was an uncouth man. He asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science appertaining to natural philosophy." End quote. It's the same line as 1818, but Victor shares his dislike for him immediately, while 1818 Victor is like, "Oh yeah, he's a real polite guy." But once he's offended by Mr. Crump, he's like, "Well, actually, this whole time you've been ugly and short and ugly." Victor isn't the only character this slow reveal of their true nature happens to. For what this novel is saying about the role of parents, it's notable that that change happens to Victor's dad. In 1818, Victor's dad is a pretty nice guy. He retires to take care of his kids. He encourages Victor to study what he wants. But when Victor comes home from university, we learn something interesting about him. Victor comes into the house we thought we knew, and begins describing a painting above the fireplace. Quote, "It was an historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. There was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity." End quote. I'm sorry, what? This is not in line with the 1818 dad we thought we knew. Now, this description is in both versions, but I can definitely see the creepy, overbearing 1831 Alphonse having this weird painting. In 1831, in Victor's intro of his parents, he says, quote, "I was their plaything and their idol," end quote. Based on how Alphonse coddles Caroline, his woman of a soft mind, and how he idolizes her in this painting, Alphonse is replicating his objectification and idolization of Caroline in Victor, who, in turn, treats Elizabeth the same way. The 1818 and the 1831 Victor are what this whole novel questions, nature versus nurture. Look at Caroline's actions in 1831. Remember how she chose Elizabeth? Remember how she picked her because of her perceived beauty, and how she too didn't see Elizabeth as a full person, but a commodity. She presents Elizabeth to Victor as, quote, "a promised gift." We can see where Victor learned this mentality of having ownership over others. He escalates that further by thinking it's not just okay to objectify women, it's okay to do that to all of humanity. He doesn't see them as people, but something to be ruled over. Quote, "A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs." End quote. But this same line is found in the 1818 version. This is what I mean by how identical actions are now colored by the different ways Victor and his parents and other characters have been set up. In the original, Alphonse doesn't retire because he sees Caroline as someone of feeble mind he needs to take care of. Caroline doesn't go shopping amongst the poor for a pretty wife for Victor. Victor devolves into this mentality on his own. It's more in his nature. He doesn't learn to view the poor as people to service his needs like he does from Caroline in 1831. In both editions, when he moves into the village to make the creature's bride, he notes that he has to repair the house he was staying in and order more stuff to make his lab. He says that the villagers should have been suspicious of this, quote, "had not all the senses of the cottagers been benumbed by want and squalid poverty. As it was, I lived ungazed at and unmolested, hardly thanked for the pittance of food and clothes which I gave. So much does suffering blunt even the coarsest sensations of men." End quote. While Victor grows up surrounded by that class and racial superiority mentality in 1831, in the original text, he is the character that presents that idea. To be clear, I am not saying that 1831 Victor is blameless in holding these beliefs. He's a grown man who boasts how highly educated he is. I'm saying that we can see where those ideas came from in 1831. For 1818 Victor, that's all you, man. Now, you've probably noticed I haven't analyzed the creature at all here. That's because he has little to no change at all, except for some word choice that I guess you can get really nitty-gritty in the analysis of, like changing, quote, "my enemy is not impregnable" in 1818 to, quote, "my enemy is not invulnerable" in 1831. Besides that and some cuts for redundancy, he's pretty untouched, which I find so funny because if you look at the chart of changes, his 7 chapters, I think, are just entirely blank because Mary Shelley knew that they were perfect. Similarly, with Walton, there is minimal change to him. Similar to Victor in both editions, Walton is willing to die fighting off the creature in 1831, like some sort of hero. Again, more nitty-gritty stuff which doesn't really fit here in this video, which is why I highly encourage you to do your own tandem read. I see these editions like conjoined twins. You can ask them about their upbringing, and even though most of it might be similar, there's some nuances in their different experiences. How their father treated this one in comparison to that one. How this caused one of them to treat their partner differently. How both of them, for some reason, have delusions of grandeur. Both are going to focus on and leave out different things based on their differing personalities and their interests. It's only when you look at their two sides that you can get a better understanding of their life as a whole. These are just my main analyses from my tandem read. I haven't even listed every single difference in the 2 editions, which kind of makes me mad because I did dig through and note every single one of them. But it would genuinely be so confusing if I listed them all in this video. But there is plenty more meaning to find in those differences, beyond not just what I've shared, but even what I know. The fun thing about this text is it really is like the multiverse of madness when it comes to all these different editions with all these different interpretations of those different editions and how those different editions, different interpretations intersect with one another. There's Doylist readings, Watsonian readings, feminist, colonialist, racial, transgender, historical, biographical, and much, much more. That can only really be filled in by you. Your own personal experience and understandings are what's kept this story living, for better or for worse, for over 2 centuries. I can't wait to hear what you discover. Thank you very much for watching my now 2nd video essay. I really appreciate your interest in all of these niche topics I have to talk about, and I hope you find this video a good jumping off point for your own analysis. I have listed all my sources in the description if you want to check those out as well, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!